Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, November 22nd, 2021. And if you're like me, when you think about founders that were known for supporting sound money against fiat that we have today, you generally think about people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, maybe even Edmund Randolph, people who were vehemently opposed to the creation of the central bank in 1791. But on this episode, I want to take a look at another that we usually don't think of. That's Thomas Paine and his vehement opposition to paper money and all the evils. He referred to it as the evils of paper money back in 1786. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this show, all the archives for over 3 years. On individual episodes like this one today, I will include links to stuff that I talk about so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. Sometimes I even include other episodes that you should check out, like as a precursor. Not today. You can also find all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and Twitter, but we also live stream at the decentralized, censorship-resistant Odyssey.com. It's actually my favorite video platform right now. But we also put the archive of our videos, and hopefully we'll start doing more live streams elsewhere at places like Rumble and Ben Swan's Sovereign, S-O-V-R-E-N, Sovereign.media. We're on BitChute and BitTube and Brighteon and Minds and Me all over the place. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition at all the usual suspects: Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and the rest. And over on that show homepage, you can also find our membership program. If you're thinking about spending some loot this Thanksgiving week, we hope that you'll give at least a little consideration to supporting the work here of the 10th Amendment Center for as little as $2 a month. The show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to Liberty. And while we give people another moment or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream, some of these mainstream platforms will get people telling us, oh, I got the notification the last 2 minutes. I mean, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but I want to allow people another moment or so and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Richard in Fredonia, Kansas. Andrew Green, good to see you on a live stream in Northwest Missouri. Tim Martin in Arizona. Deep South Granny, that's awesome. Dixie Strong in 64 in Alabama. Shortest Straw in Northeast Kansas. Brody in Georgia. Melody Skaman. Joyce Code, I apologize if I get your name wrong. Clay Kent, good to see you. Jay Armstrong, Haji, 1954 in Michigan. Joe Vasquez, Richard Banks, somebody trying to sell me stuff on Twitch. EHP Training, good to see you, buddy. Been a while. And everyone else, I appreciate you being here. There's Justin and Ightlander. Thank you so much for joining me here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. But let's get right to it. And I want to start out with an article a few years ago by a guy named Lawrence H. White over at Cato Institute. And here's how he put it. Here's the backstory. Let's just set the stage. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about the chartering of what's called the Bank of North America in 1781. But here's how he put it. Here's the backstory. The Continental Congress chartered the Bank of North America, headquartered in Philadelphia, and headed by Robert Morris and Thomas Willing in 1781. Considering a Commonwealth of Pennsylvania charter to be a sounder authorization, fascinated at that time under the Articles of Confederation when they were trying to make sure there was a lot of issues with debts and back pay and all kinds of stuff from the war. And we hear people like James Madison look at the war being the greatest threat to the public liberty because he said it leads to armies and debts and taxes. Armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. When you're in a great deal of debt after a war, even if it was for a good cause, you can have a lot of problems. And there certainly were a lot of problems in that period. But they were actually thinking of a state charter for a bank to help finance a lot of that stuff to be a sounder choice than under the Articles of Confederation. I thought that was fascinating. Thought I'd just kind of lean into that a little bit. But considering a Commonwealth of Pennsylvania charter to be a sounder authorization, in 1782, the bank sought and received a charter from the Pennsylvania legislature. And then after the war's end, officially in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, of course, we know that fighting had basically subsided quite a while before then, but they made it official. So after the war's end in 1783, as historian Janet Wilson noted, farmers in western Pennsylvania, there were a lot of issues with farmers in western Pennsylvania. If we think about that whole period, and then leading up till after the ratification, the hated whiskey tax, where farmers in Pennsylvania, especially western Pennsylvania, a lot of people who had difficulty reading, they didn't have education. I mean, they had better education probably than, even without reading and writing well, better than what a lot of us get today in government propaganda indoctrination centers, but that's a different discussion. But if you think about the whiskey tax that happened, so there was some conflict happening there for quite some time. But farmers in western Pennsylvania with large debts and tax arrears set up a cry for paper money. Now, I don't know if it was always the average person doing that, but there was a demand for paper money to be issued by the Commonwealth. These state-issued notes would not be presently redeemable, but would be receivable for future tax payments. So there was actually demand on a state level for paper money versus sound money. The inflationists, and I like that Lawrence put it that way, because we often think, especially today, we think of inflation as being price increases. You go to the market and your eggs cost twice as much as they used to. Well, it's not to say that all corporations are good, but it's not the nasty corporations trying to rip you off. They want to sell you as much stuff as possible. Inflation and price increases really, what inflation is an increase in the money supply. So as soon as you print more dollars, that is what inflation is. The result of inflation is all kinds of destruction of the economy through lack of purchasing power, because as you have more paper notes to buy the same amount of stuff, then that stuff is going to cost more. You have more dollars chasing the same products. But anyways, the inflationists understandably saw the Bank of North America as a barrier to their plan. So people who wanted to print paper money saw the Bank of North America, surprisingly, as, and this wasn't like a central bank like the first bank of the U.S. or the second bank or the Federal Reserve, nothing like that. It was just something that was chartered. It was the first commercial bank. And because the bank was only exchanging for sound money, for silver and gold. And so when you print money, then this is kind of getting in the way. So they saw this as a barrier to their plan. If the bank valued the state paper below its value, because if it's just printed on paper and it's not backed by anything and you try to exchange it for silver, they're not going to exchange it 1-to-1. I mean, obviously, it's probably not even close. While B&A banknotes and checks traded at par in terms of the silver dollars, for which they could be immediately redeemed. Real demand for the state paper currency would be low. So I should be able to go out and buy a really, really fancy lunch, including a tip, for $1, one silver dollar. But one silver dollar is worth, I don't know what it is, I haven't looked in a while, but it could be somewhere between 17 and 25 fiat. It's probably worth much, much more than that without some market suppression. But real demand for the state paper currency would be low. And when we think about this whole concept might be foreign to us. The Bank of North America was for sound money, and the state plan was inflation and fiat. It's totally backwards, especially when we consider today, when we compare things to the Federal Reserve. Not that the states are really on board with sound money, but we're seeing some moves, some early steps in places like Utah, where they passed in 2011 the Legal Tender Act, which is actually to recognize gold and silver as what they have been all along, that as money for the payment of debts, tender for the payment of debts, as money as the Constitution requires. And so because of that, a nice business was set up in early 2011, 2012. Alpine Gold, originally called the United Precious Metals Association. It was established here from their website in response to the passage of the Utah Specie Legal Tender Act in early 2011. UPMA aims to provide its members with viable choices in currencies pegged to U.S. minted gold and silver dollars. They also created a product called the Goldback, and this is the world's first physical interchangeable gold money. It's like it looks like a dollar-ish, but it's a goldback, and it's actually made. One single goldback is worth $3.83 in fiat. So just a quick aside, pointing out that things are probably totally opposite of what we're describing in this history, short lesson, we can call it that. Now back to Lawrence White at Cato, he says, with the legislature voting to authorize an issue of state notes, so fiat money, in mid-1785, the inflationists demanded repeal of the Bank of North America's charter. They just, it was chartered in the state. They wanted to get rid of it. They were further motivated by the bank proprietors' public opposition to state paper. So they were very vehement. The people who were running the bank, Robert Morris and others, were really, really railing for quite some time against the idea of printing paper money. The legislature debated and then repealed the charter in 1785. So there was a lot of pressure, and they got rid of the BNA, but the BNA then continued to do business. It's weird how this kind of plays out, but it was doing business on a smaller scale under the original charter from the Continental Congress. So it still existed, even though they tried to shut it down, but in practice, it wasn't operating very well. 18 months after repeal, in 1787, following a pitched public discussion and the election of pro-bank legislators. It's interesting to call them pro-bank because we think of banking as different today. They were just saying pro-sound money. I guess we could call it pro-sound money. Legislators in fall 1786, the charter was restored. And that brings me to Thomas Paine, who was a huge part of this debate. And I have known some quotes from this paper. It's called Dissertations on Government. It was kind of a collection of original thoughts plus a number of letters and essays that he had written over a period of months regarding paper money and sound money and this issue of the bank, the BNA, and the state-issued paper money. But he published this in February 18th, 1786. The first section is a really fascinating overview of the nature of government, and this is done like Paine always. He says, every government starts itself in this form, and then you have despotic monarchies, and this is how they control power. So he talked about the nature of government, of power, of sovereignty, and that is final authority. And then he went into some history over the founding of the bank and the nitty-gritty details over its existence. But the third section, I think, is what's most important. And I had only looked at some quotes, published some memes over the years, and then I was making some new t-shirt designs for the 10th Amendment Center store over at shop.10thamendmentcenter.com, where you can get a nice new Thomas Paine t-shirt, Thomas Paine quote shirt, just very simple designs, not like the join or die one that I'm wearing. But anyways, I'm like, I should just read through this in detail. So that's how I spent my Saturday night celebrating reading Thomas Paine on fiat currency. So in his third section, he gets into the dangers of paper money. So he says, having now finished with the report, I proceed to the third and last subject, that of paper money. And I think this is a great way to really hammer it home right off the bat. He says, I remember a German farmer expressing as much in a few words as the whole subject requires. Money is money. Paper is paper. That could be the end of the story. TLDR, TLDW, money is money. Paper is paper. We've got a great Ron Paul quote that we share pretty often. He says, paper is not money, paper is fraud. Thomas Jefferson referred to paper as not being money. It's only the ghost of money. It's not money itself. And that's the same message that Thomas Paine is saying here. Some years earlier in 1786, money is money, paper is paper. Even if he's paraphrasing some anecdotal quote from somebody, some German farmer, who knows who it was, but it's a really great statement. He says, all the invention of man cannot make them otherwise. So no matter what anyone happens to tell you, money is still going to be money, and paper is still going to be paper, no matter how they assign it. And here began from Lawrence White, and this is actually via a letter one of the letters that he kind of put together these thoughts on, Thomas Paine did. This was in April of 1786. He says, the clamor for irredeemable paper money, and he continued the argument, and I've got another one from November of 1786 when they finally shut this whole paper money process down, at least to some degree. The clamor for irredeemable paper money, wrote Paine, derived from delusion and bubble. Bubble is what we live in today. We live in a total bubble economy manipulated by the inflationary practices of the Federal Reserve. Here's what Paine had to say. He said, gold and silver are the emissions of nature. Paper is the emission of art. The value of gold and silver is ascertained by the quantity which nature has made in the earth. So a limited quantity, although I know there's some debate these days, especially between gold and crypto, people who support Bitcoin with a finite 21 million versus gold, well, you keep discovering more, but it's such a slow process. And then the counter argument is, well, it's not just Bitcoin. Someone can just people can keep creating different fiat cryptocurrencies. But the short version is when you have a finite version of something, then you can value it, or close to a finite version. You can have some level of value. But when they can just print it out of thin air, when they can just make it up, then you don't actually have a way to actually have a real value of it. And we've seen this. There are studies that show that the purchasing power of the U.S. fiat dollar has gone down since its inception, anywhere from 95 to 98%. It's worth almost nothing. Again, I could be able to buy a really fancy lunch with a tip for $1. Now it costs me $18 to $25, if not more. And that's going up because they keep printing more and more fiat funny money. Anyways, going further, Paine says gold and silver, their value is not in the impression, even if they make it into a coin. The value is not in the making of the coin. If you take away the impression in the coin, still the same value remains. So the 1 ounce of gold, 1 ounce of silver is worth 1 ounce of gold or 1 ounce of silver, whether it's got an official stamp from some government or it's just in a bar. Alter it as you will, he says, or expose it to any misfortune that can happen, still the value is not diminished. It has, therefore, all the requisite qualities that money can have. Thomas Paine understood in 1786. This is maybe like 10 years after even Adam Smith. I mean, these are very new concepts. He sounds like an Austrian economist at this point to some degree. He understands what money is more than 99% of people alive today, that has certain qualities that make it money. And he says it is a fit material to make money of, and nothing which has not all those properties can be fit for the purpose of money. He says the only proper use for paper, so he's recognizing that printing paper, we call it money. Paper is a promissory note. It's not actually the money. And that's why Thomas Jefferson said it's the ghost of money. It's not money itself. Even if you can redeem it for actual money, for sound money, for hard money, for gold and silver, for example, the paper isn't money itself. It's just a representation of ownership. It's like a stock certificate or something in money. He says the only proper use for paper in the room of money is to write promissory notes and obligations of payment in specie upon. A piece of paper thus written and signed is worth the sum it is given for if the person who gives it is able to pay it, because in this case, the law will oblige him. Anyways, if he's worth nothing, the paper note is worth nothing. He says, but when an assembly undertake to issue paper as money, not just something that's a promissory note redeemable in real money, the whole system of safety and certainty is overturned and property set afloat. Paper notes, Paine writes, given and taken between individuals as a promise of payment is one thing. But paper issued by an assembly, by a government, as money, and he put in italics, as money, is another thing. It is like putting an apparition in the place of a man. It vanishes with looking at it, and nothing remains but the air. That's so awesome. Such awesome stuff. Going on, he says, now I shall enumerate some of the evils of paper money and conclude with offering means for preventing them. He actually had some pretty harsh thoughts. I'll let you guys read the paper in full. Of course, I will link to it in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So he says, one of the evils of paper money is that it turns the whole country into stock jobbers. I had to look that one up. Stock jobbers is basically not being an official broker trading for someone else, but you're actually having to be a stock trader in your head. Well, how much is this worth today? And we don't even think of it like that. We think the store is ripping us off by raising prices. We don't generally, well, when I say we, I mean most people. You and I probably recognize like, oh, I go to the market and this bottle of water that used to cost 59 cents is now $1.99. I'm not thinking, the brand Essentia is trying to screw me over, or the little Japanese market that I go to pick it up is trying to screw me over. They're just trying to make a living, and they probably don't make a huge profit on a bottle of water. But who's really ripping us off, and they've been ripping us off since before we were born, is the Federal Reserve and the politicians and corporate backers who love this stuff. The whole banking system today is absolutely ripping us off. The whole fractional reserve system, the corporate banks are part of this whole system. Anyways, one of the evils of paper money is it turns the whole country into stock jobbers. Now I'm going to have to figure out, what is this thing worth? And I've even made jokes. I remember I was at like a Nordstrom rack or something a while ago, and someone there was, walking through the aisle. I'm looking at some cheap shoes, and there's a $5 bill or a $10 bill. And she was like, "Oh, is that yours?" I'm like, I don't know. It's fiat money. Is it even worth anything? And some normie literally just was like, "Oh, yeah, right." Understood the joke, because they know that this paper, I think inherently some people know that we're getting screwed over. I wish they knew a little bit more. Anyways, the precariousness, Paine writes, of its value and the uncertainty of its fate continually operate night and day to produce this destructive effect. Having no real value in itself, the paper then, it depends for support upon accident, caprice, and party. And as it is the interest of some to depreciate and others to raise its value, there is a continual invention going on that destroys the morals of the country. It turns people into partisans, drives people to factions. We know that factions cause fighting and all kinds of problem, and it leads to more centralization of power, and on and on and on. So this is one of the evils of paper money. But then he says, the evils of paper money have no end. Thomas Paine, not the guy that we think of as the sound money guy, but he was way more on it than anyone that I know. Banned talk over, I've just seen in the chat, which just happens to be in a window layer. Common sense should be mandatory reading for all Americans. Well, I mean, we don't want to do it as forced, but we would certainly want to encourage that. And it's interesting because Paine was the most widely read publication. His Common Sense, published in January of 1776. He was famous for this. And he was signing off these letters that he was publishing in the Pennsylvania Packet with common sense. And this is common sense as well, to not depreciate the purchasing power of people's money by using something else in its stead. The evils of paper money, he wrote, have no end. Its uncertain and fluctuating value is continually awaking or creating new schemes of deceit. Boy, that really plays out today. We see it play out every moment. Every principle of justice is put to the rack, and the bond of society dissolved. The suppression, therefore, of paper money might very properly have been put into the act for preventing vice and immorality. So banning vice and immorality should include paper money. Not that I want to use government force, and that's probably where I disagree with Paine on this, but they says they have no end. Now back to Lawrence White. He says, those thinking that state paper will relieve a shortage, and oftentimes we'll hear this, oh, what are you going to do, carrying around a bunch of gold bars and be able to buy stuff? I mean, there's not enough of it to be able to use it as money, so we got to do this other way. And this is an argument that's been around all along. Paine dealt with this argument in 1786, and White discusses it here. He says, those thinking that state paper will relieve a shortage of specie have it backwards. It is precisely the issue of irredeemable paper that drives out gold and silver. And here's how Paine put it. He says, the pretense for paper money has been that there was not a sufficiency of gold and silver. This, so far from being a reason for paper emissions, is a reason against them, because the fixed limited supply, or I guess fixed is in quotes, it's not absolutely fixed, but it's pretty close in comparison to printing paper and trillions of dollars printed. It certainly is fixed. So a limited supply means the value. Supply and demand, this is just basic stuff that everyone understands. If there's high demand and low supply, then the value is high and it keeps the value strong. He says, by following this practice, we shall continually banish the specie till we have none left and be continually complaining of the grievance instead of remedying the cause, and the cause being the paper money. And then he gets into the idea of legal tender laws, that they're requiring paper to be used as the payment of debt rather than money itself. He says, as to the assumed authority, and this is how he's always connecting it to the basic structure of government and power, and authoritarianism like he did at the beginning of this paper, which I did not cover, but I think it's really good to read. It's got a lot of the themes that he wrote in 1776 as well, and in the American Crisis. But he says, as to the assumed authority of any assembly in making paper money or paper of any kind a legal tender, or in other language, a compulsive payment, forcing people to use something, even though it isn't money, he says it is the most presumptuous attempt at arbitrary power. Arbitrary power to the founders and the old revolutionaries was considered a tyranny. If government was not within fixed rules and could just do what it wanted out of necessity, that was what they considered a despotism. And I think Paine would have known this, that everyone understood that. And so therefore he included this. This is a very powerful statement at the time. To most people today, just saying, oh, well, they're going to have arbitrary power. A lot of people are going to have to look up, what do they mean by arbitrary? So it's really an unfortunate how the system and the people have been so dumbed down by government-run education. We shouldn't even call it government-run education because no one's getting educated. Government propaganda. Anyways, there can be no such power in a Republican government. The people have no freedom, said Paine, and property no security where this practice can be acted. So if anywhere that a government can force people to use paper rather than money as a payment, rather than a free choice of how, like if two people want to use paper and it's up to them to take the risk, that's their call. But to actually ban people from using it, and even where they don't ban it, they often add things today like taxes. So for example, a number of states still charge a sales tax. They treat gold and silver as property. We know the federal government does. And they want you to actually start paying taxes on it on unrealized gains. So like if you bought something at $1,000 and then the value goes up to $3,000 and you've not sold it, you're just holding on to it, they want you to pay taxes on the additional $2,000 because they don't want anyone to be able to save and hold wealth. They want people, or build wealth, or even just to get by. They want everyone to rely on the government and their welfare and their handouts and their total control. And this is one of the ways you bring a population to their knees. And I think Paine, whether he knew that that's how it was going to play out or not, he certainly foresaw that allowing a government to control whether or not people could use something as money and then enforce it in a contract, in a court of law, well, he knew this would be a place where property would not be secure, there would be no security, and the people could have no freedom. And he certainly nailed it. He says, the committee who shall bring in a report for this purpose. So any government committee that says, hey, let's have a legal tender law that requires them to use paper as money, he says, or the member who moves for it and he who seconds it merits impeachment. Even just bringing it up to Paine merits impeachment. He talked about other more aggressive responses as well that I think, again, I'm just teasing it out there. You should read the whole thing. And then he goes on, and we're getting close to summing it up here pretty soon. He says, if anything had or could have a value equal to gold and silver, it would require no tender law. So if paper was worth it, you wouldn't have to use the force of government. You've probably seen the meme out there, Twitter or some other social platform, where good ideas don't require force. If it is a good idea, you don't have to use the barrel of a gun to tell people, if you try to do it differently, we're going to lock you up. We're going to fine you. If you don't pay the fine, we're going to lock you up. If you don't come voluntarily, we're going to take you. I mean, good ideas don't use force. And this is the Thomas Paine version of it. If anything could have a value equal to gold and silver, it would require no tender law. And if it had not that value, it ought not to have such a law. And therefore, all tender laws, and the tender laws he's talking about are those that require the use of paper as money in the payment of debt, exchanging it for real money. All tender laws are tyrannical and unjust and calculated to support fraud and oppression. He says, as to paper money, in any light it can be viewed, it is at best a bubble, and those bubbles burst. And back to Lawrence over at Cato, he says, Paine understood that any stimulus, and it's really interesting that he pointed this out. This was in 2016, but stimulus is what we live under constantly. And stimulus sounds like a positive term, and we should probably come up with something else because they aren't stimulating. In the long run, they're actually making everything far worse. We need to see a Band-Aid ripoff, but he knew that this was only temporary. When you inject more cash into the system, more paper dollars into the system, it's only temporary. It seems like things are going well, but over time, and we're seeing this play out very fast today, you get shortages and price increases. He says, because issuing more paper money does not create more wealth. Savings creates wealth. He even offered the binge drinking and hangover analogy that has in modern times become commonplace. Here's how Paine put it. Paper money is like dram drinking. I gotta look up dram drinking. I don't know what it means. Maybe someone knows in the chat. Paper money is like dram drinking. It relieves for a moment by deceitful sensation, but gradually diminishes the natural heat and leaves the body worse than it found. Were not this the case, and could money be made of paper at pleasure, every sovereign in Europe would be as rich as he pleased. Yeah, why not have a $10 million minimum wage? We can all just be rich, work for 1 hour, and retire. No one needs to save. No one needs to invent. No one needs to invest. No one needs to do anything. No one needs to plan. You just have to print more cash and just hand it out. We're all just loaded, right? And that's what Paine is saying here. He's like, if this was the situation, we'd all be rich, everyone. He says, but the truth is that it is a bubble, and the attempt was vanity. And just to wrap it up, this is a follow-up letter that he wrote in November 7th, 1786. Again, this is from the Pennsylvania Packet. He says, the abuse of power always operates to call the right of that power in question. To judge of the right or power of any assembly in America to make those bills a legal tender, we must have recourse to the principles on which civil government is founded. For if such an act is not compatible with those principles, the assembly which assumes such a power assumes a power unknown in civil government and commits treason against its principles. So if the foundation of the system is not based on an abuse of power and they have certain limits and they're just making it up, then this is treason. St. George Tucker in 1803, I've mentioned this many times on the show, referred to usurpation, which is an assumption of power not delegated to the government in the Constitution. Usurpation is treason against the sovereignty meaning final authority of the people. And here, Paine is saying it's treason against the principles of what it was founded on. He says the fundamental principles of civil government are security of our rights and persons as freemen and security of property. A tender law, therefore, cannot stand on the principles of civil government because it operates to take away a man's share of civil and natural freedom and to render property insecure. I don't know what took me so long to read this in full, but I'm glad I was able to spend my Saturday night and then share a little of the highlights. I hope it's interesting enough to you that you'll consider reading it in full. Of course, I will link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. I generally publish that about an hour or 2 hours after the show's done. But of course, if you enjoyed the show, it was educational, fun to watch, listen to, whatever, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button on YouTube or Facebook or elsewhere, leaving comments, all the stuff to help trigger the algorithm and tell the platform to show the program to more people. Let me take a quick look over in the live chat and see if there's anything else. Andrea Rodriguez is absolutely right. It's called a Ponzi scheme. I mean, so are so many of these programs, right? Jay Armstrong, stimulus feeds the rich. And this is something that's so interesting to see from the left that they just miss. Well, they all miss this. But when they hand out all this loot, generally it's the big banking, the big special interests that get the loot first, and they get to spend it at current prices. But by the time it trickles out to the rest of society, it takes a little bit of time for the price increases to hit. And so therefore, it's ripping us off. Ron Paul often calls inflation a hidden tax. It is a theft. Philip Lavery said, would it be correct to say people who support paper money have a shorter time preference? I don't know. That's something you'd ask somebody like Bob Murphy. That's definitely over my head, but I understand where you're coming from on this. My guess is absolutely, but I could be way off. I don't know my Austrian economics nearly enough. Jason Carey says, end the Federal Reserve and our problems will begin to recede. Absolutely. Andrew Green, thanks for bringing this paper to our attention. Great episode. Imagine the prosperity of the world if the central bankers hadn't been leeching for a century. And of course, all the people who love the central bankers, they love the printing because the federal government couldn't do the stuff that it does today. It couldn't be the largest. It could be awful. but it wouldn't be the largest government and the largest military empire in history with everyone just begging to get a handout. They wouldn't be able to shut down businesses for a year or 6 months and then just print a bunch of cash and hand it out to people and hope that they can get by for a little while and not be too upset when the prices go up, more thankful that they can finally work, bringing people to their knees. This type of stuff wouldn't happen at all. Ban Talk says Paine was amazing at speaking to everyday people and connecting them to the problems of the time. We owe him a lot. Without him, we may have never won the minds needed for revolution. Yeah, he was pretty awesome. Ed Hen says, I don't see the name highlighted. I'm not sure. Maybe that was just a chat issue. Just scrolling enough. Yeah, Ban Talk, again, just look at the buying power of an ounce of gold in 1900 versus today. And that's kind of what I'm referring to when I'm saying, oh, I could buy, they'll say, oh, you could buy, for example, a pair of shoes. I mean, I can go and get a decent, just walk around pair, not fancy pair of shoes for like $30 online. And again, that's basically $1. If it's one silver dollar, I should be able to buy that for $1. Now that we're having to work longer hours and more to earn more stuff, where our purchasing power is less and less, the amount of dollars that we earn doesn't increase at the same rate as the inflation leads to the price increase. I don't know if that makes sense. This is not necessarily my strong suit, but hopefully it makes at least a little bit of sense. Anyways, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you had a good weekend. I hope you have a nice Thanksgiving up ahead planned. I'm going to do a show on Wednesday as normal on the normal time, but I will take off on Friday. I've got a lot of stuff going on it's a busy time for all of us. So I hope you guys have a really nice Thanksgiving weekend. Of course, I appreciate you being here. Please, again, consider smashing the like button, the review on podcast, and our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime programs that you can see all on that page. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, a happy and safe and fruitful Thanksgiving this week. And I really appreciate you being here. I'll see you next time on the Path to Liberty.